Hello and welcome to Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. Now this is where we take a look inside the world of media, analysing the trends, the issues and the reporting of some of this week's top stories. And don't forget you can tweet us your thoughts at SA Media Monitor, and you can also use the hashtag SABC Media Monitor. We really look forward to hearing from you. I'm Peter Ndoro and this is what's coming up on the show today. Well, it looks like the SARS rogue unit story is far from over. Journalist Peter Ndoro has taken to Twitter to expose journalists that he believes have been gunning for his downfall. Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng questions the manner in which the Keletso Bizoski Manyike was portrayed by the Sunday Times journalist Jacques Pauw, and he also questions the journalists' integrity in terms of media bias. We'll also be taking a look at some of the front pages of the Sunday newspapers. In fact, let's start by taking a look at them right now. Right, the Sunday Times, well, this week leads with a story about the late former soccer star Mark Batchelor, saying that police are investigating whether he was killed over his apparent role in the theft of 1 ton of cocaine smuggled into South Africa last year. The City Press is reporting that President Ramaphosa's back is against the wall, with the paper suggesting detractors within the ANC will not support action against Public Protector Justice Mogoeng, whilst opposition parties want Parliament to discipline the President. The Sunday Independent headline, well, the Ramaphosa shifts the blame to Watson. The paper says that Bosasa Boss is the one who should be the money laundering suspect, as he's the one who routed his donation through third parties. That's what the president was saying. This is part of his 51-page response to the Public Protector just before she released her final report that found him guilty of misleading Parliament. The Sunday Tribune, well, the president is also the front page in the Sunday Tribune with the headline, Impeach Ramaphosa. This, as the report says, that the DA, the EFF and co-parties are taking aim at the president after the release of that damning Public Protector report this past week. The DA say that they'll also be laying money laundering charges against the president as well. The Weekend Argus is leading with the same story as its sister paper, the Sunday Independent, saying that President Ramaphosa told the Public Protector Bosasa's Gavin Watson is the one who used third parties to make his donation, and that the president knew nothing about the donation or how it was channeled to the his ANC presidential campaign account. All right, so that's the front pages of your newspapers. But as you know, a lot of people now don't even read the papers because they wake up and the first thing they do is check their phones and see what's trending. So let's take a look and see what's trending this morning on your social media platform, Twitter. I'm going to tell you that a little bit earlier on, Gareth Bale was the #1 tweet. Now, Gareth Bale is a football player, plays for Real Madrid, and the boss, Zinedine Zidane, has basically said we can't wait for him to go. So there'll be a lot of people looking to buy Gareth Bale. Zinedine Zidane, Real Madrid, seemingly not wanting him. Pacquiao and Thurman, well, that story tells about Manny Pacquiao, who is a boxer, of course, and he's won the WBA World Welterweight title at 40 years old. Can you believe it? And Keith Thurman, this was his first loss. The Sacred Space, that talks about one of our radio stations, Radio Metro. It's a beautiful program in the morning called The Sacred Space with the Tamin Gubeni, and there's a big thing about a celebration that's taking place on the 21st of September at Carnival City, a Sacred Space Carnival. And #4, Zidane there again, shocking everybody by basically saying that he wants to get rid of Gareth Bale. I'm hoping that he'll come to Manchester United, but that's just me. So those are some of the things that are trending on social media at the moment. So as you can see, there's so much to get through on the show this morning, and helping us make sense of these stories are my guest editors today. And we say welcome to Rulani Baloyi, who's the SABC National Copy Editor for Radio News, and Alex Mitchley, a journalist from News 24. To both of you, a very good morning. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good morning.
Morning.
There we go. We'll be chatting to them shortly. But first, former Sunday Times journalist Pete Rampedi earlier this week took to social media, making damning allegations on Twitter against a number of journalists that he claims plotted to silence him and his colleagues. Rampedi and Zilikazi Wa Africa were forced to resign after the Sunday Times retracted their report on the so-called SARS rogue unit in 2005. Rampedi, who's currently an investigations editor at Independent Media as well as editor at African Times, composed over 40 tweets where he labelled journalists, amongst others, as part of a cabal conniving to destroy him. SANEF were named as a media faction, being foot soldiers of billionaire philanthropist George Soros. Well, the executive director of the South African National Editors Forum, SANEF, Kate Skinner, joins us now via Skype. Kate, thanks very much for joining us and welcome to the program.
Hello.
All right, so Pete Rampedi says that you are a media faction, that you are foot soldiers of billionaire philanthropist George Soros. What's SANEF's reaction to that?
Well, I mean, we do get funding from George Soros. We got a specific amount of money to look at election issues, and we ran a whole lot of election training workshops. But obviously we get money from a whole lot of different sources, including our own members and also from the media companies. To say that basically we are getting funding from George Soros and therefore being controlled by George Soros is not correct. Because the funding is given to us and we are then free to use it as we want to, as long as it is for the specific tasks such as election training. So I think what is important to say is that we've got to look at what Peter Rampedi is saying and saying, of course he can be critical, of course he can say that there are problems. But the thing is that he needs to go through the correct channels. So there are channels such as the Press Council. I mean, when it's broadcast, it's the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. And it's very interesting that he is not actually picking things up in terms of taking them through the correct channels, which means that then it's very difficult to respond to him. And that for us is a big issue. The other thing, of course, is that SANEF has actually launched an inquiry into ethics and credibility issues. And we would welcome Peter Rampedi coming to that commission of inquiry. It's an independent commission of inquiry with Judge Satchwell heading it up, Judge Kathy Satchwell, and he could come and basically put those issues on the table so that the commission of inquiry can actually investigate it.
Well, he says that this inquiry is compromised because it's a SANEF-initiated inquiry.
Well, yes, I know he's saying that, but the thing is that it is a specific, is he then saying that the three panelists, so it would be Nikiwe Bakicha, it is also Rich Makondo, and, basically the panel is chaired by Kathy Satchwell. Is he then saying that those three people are compromised? I mean, my sense is that doesn't make sense. It's an independent inquiry. Yes, of course, we initiated it. We did find the funding for it. And we put together terms of reference, which are on our website, and anybody can look at that. So he would then have to be saying that, that in fact, those three panelists are in fact compromised. And my sense is, well, give us the proof, give us the evidence that they are compromised.
All right, so the other issue and what sort of piqued my interest is not so much what he said about all these other journalists, but the fact that he said it on social media. And I just wonder, as SANEF, as a body that kind of looks at journalists and journalism in the country, what is your first thoughts about journalists when they do this, that they start accusing fellow journalists about certain misdeeds on social media?
Well, I think it's a very, very dangerous thing to do, because basically what it means is that it then sort of says, you can target these journalists. And it means that, people on Twitter, can go and abuse, bully, harass these particular journalists. And so it's an incredibly dangerous thing to do, to name particular journalists and to basically almost then say, well, look, we unleash the kind of troll armies against these particular people. It's an extremely destructive thing to do. Criticize, absolutely, but to name particular people, particularly in the context of Twitter, where we know it is such a toxic kind of place, not to follow proper channels, not to go to the Commission of Inquiry. Well, why are you not doing that? So then if you don't follow those correct channels, then basically, my sense would be you're not trying to solve the problem, you are actually being destructive.
So is SANEF going to intervene? Can you even intervene in this spat? Because some of these journalists have been responding and fighting back, and it's all playing out on social media. And I'm going to ask in a short while what that might mean to readers. But is there anything you can do to try and, mediate?
That's a difficult question, and my sense is that what we can do is, in terms of our panelists, we can actually say, but obviously our panelists have to decide for themselves. But my sense is that it would be useful for them to approach Peter Ndoro and Mzilikazi Y Africa, and specifically ask them to make a submission. As SANEF, one of the things that we have got, which we're in the middle of, is a court case, which is specifically around the EFF and the EFF targeting particular journalists. And we're basically saying that that you can't be naming particular journalists. You can critique people, but that is a dangerous process. So we have got that court case, which is going in the Equality Court at the moment, and it's specifically asking for political leaders in this particular case to apologize and not to target particular journalists, because it creates such incredible problems for those particular journalists, but also for the media sector as a whole, because then you're not going to get people reporting without fear or favor. And so we've got that on the go. But I think the issue is, I suppose what we can do is to support particular journalists in terms of saying that, we can't have this kind of cyberbullying, and we can just reiterate that point again and again. But it is certainly very difficult to work against this, and that's why these kinds of comments from journalists within the industry are so dangerous.
All right, Kate, we're going to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, as always. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Right, so that was Kate Skinner, who's Executive Director at South Africa National Editors Forum. All right, let's go over to this side of the set and chat to my guest editors. And we'll start sort of chatting a little bit about this story. It is a difficult one. When I woke up and I started seeing this list of people supposedly belonging to a cabal, I thought, my goodness, what's going on, So let me start with you, Rulani. What's your instinct? Lawyers, for example, will not rubbish each other in public. There's almost like this ethics that goes with that. And I wonder if it should be the same for journalists, or, if that's the only last resort you have is to go on social media and say your piece. What's your take on what you're seeing playing out on social media?
I think when I first heard the allegations or the claims, I said to myself, they are actually, in this specific instance, there could be three sides to the story. Peter Ndoro's side of the story, which says there is a rogue unit at SARS, or there was, and then those who are saying there was never a rogue unit, and then somewhere buried in between there could be the truth, which explains what actually happened and what is supposed to happen. And you must remember that the tricky thing with the story is that there has been reports which were actually commissioned by different ministers of finance and by our leaders in South Africa, which some of them had said one thing and then others have been withdrawn. And so it's one of those stories that, you know, we remember that KPMG withdrew their report, amongst others. And there are people who are still sticking by their reports. So you have the reports, you have the politicians, and you have the journalists being divided in between. So the noises come from both sides, are very loud and should not be ignored. Because if you look at the bigger picture, it's not necessarily about which side of the media fraternity do you belong to with a story. We need to find a way of saying reports have been compiled, some have been withdrawn, others are still standing. How do we deal with the matter going forward? Because now the public protector has also made her findings, which just makes the story to keep going on and on. Yeah,
it's fascinating. All right, Alex, let me ask you this, because, you know, as journalists, we often have our own Twitter accounts, and you can write there, these views are my own views and not the views of anybody else. But then reality actually is when a reader looks at Alex Mitchley and they take what you say a little bit more seriously than Joe Soap maybe. Do you think that that is the case? And if that is the case, do you have a greater responsibility with what you tweet?
Well, I think it definitely depends on who's reading your tweets, but I do think that there is a sense that if this is a journalist's account, they're held obviously to a higher standard, which I would agree with. I mean, if you are a journalist, a working journalist, you have an onus, you have a responsibility to try and be as unbiased as possible, be as objective as possible, and report as you understand it. So yeah, I mean, I think you are held to a higher standard, and I think that is acceptable. So yeah, you do need to watch what you are saying, and definitely if you're making accusations, you need to be able to back those up.
The danger with this story, and I'm not even going to go into the accusations per se, but more that when one journalist accuses other journalists, and these things are still being tested, Rolani, is that people's reputations are at stake here.
It is, because now we're going to find that we as the practitioners in the media, we're not going to be trusted by anyone. Or maybe we're going to find that there's going to be labels being put on people. I mean, we who work at the SABC, we know we've come a long way with not being trusted by the fact that there were times that when people were saying that at the SABC or what they're reporting, everything is controlled and all of those things. We have experienced it in the SABC where people would not watch our news, people would not listen to our news on the radio. So it's a very unproductive situation for the media that we all find ourselves in, because people are going to end up saying, oh, let me look at the byline, who wrote this story, or is one of those. So it doesn't matter how credible, how truthful that story is, but people will just question the story without just looking at the byline. So it's creating a very huge problem for the industry. And I wish there could be a way that Peter Ndoro and the journalists that he's now mentioned, people could come together and be able to sort out this matter in one way or the other. Or people could even go to the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture and say to the Commission, this is what we have. This is what I have about these people, and this is how they could have contributed to capturing of certain institutions, because this is not all about capturing of government. We need to look at how did we as the media conduct ourselves in the last 10 to 15 years, and how could we have contributed to harming other people and also harming our colleagues in this industry, because people have lost their jobs. People continue, it's difficult for some people to be hired in this industry because you've been labeled that you are the one who are supporting person A and person B. It goes beyond just naming each other, or it goes beyond just saying, I didn't do it. So there must be a way, or finding a way to say to the people, let's meet, let's talk, and what actually happened. Because I don't think that this thing could just go on forever. And
well, I think the courts are finally going to adjudicate on this thing one way or another.
Yes.
Alex, and I'm just wondering, and you know, our poor readers at home are going to have to troll through all of these things. What would your best advice be for someone who's going through all these sort of spats between journalists? How do I... What do I do? You know, how do I decide what's true, what's not true, or do I just ignore everybody?
Well, I think it's a brilliant question, and obviously, you know, we live in the age of misinformation. It's at its highest now. So, you know, when you go onto Twitter, when you go onto social media sites, there's a lot of proper information out there. There's a lot of misinformation, and everyone is just kind of slinging at one another. So, I think it's very difficult for almost anyone, for myself, to make sense of what do I believe, what seems credible, what doesn't seem credible. And that's why I agree with Rulani. I think it would be best for us to look, as journalists, we need to do introspection. We need to see where we've wronged and, you know, what we've done right as well. And I think the best would be to set up an independent inquiry and, you know, put out all these issues in the open and get to the bottom of every single one of them. But obviously, you know, I think you also need to ask yourself just logical questions as well. In the case of Rampede, there's a lot of, you know, he accuses almost 40 different people. I just, you know, this cabal, do they meet? You know, that's a question I'd love to know. You know, they're from different publications. Some of the people who's accused aren't even journalists. I'd love to know, where do they meet? And, you know, what is this greater big plan that's been formulated?
All right, okay. We'll leave it there because we're never going to solve this one, I'm afraid. Let's hope the courts can get to the bottom of it and get a ruling one way or the other. But the SARS rogue unit certainly has affected much more than just the South African Revenue Service and Praveen Gordhan, it seems. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, is the media biased? Well, Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng seems to think so.
As the world prepares to mark Nelson Mandela International Day this July, we speak to Africans on the continent and in the diaspora who are doing good. Individuals who reflect the values and legacy of South Africa's first democratically elected president.
It is a story about humanity's great capacity for goodness, for peace, and for hope.
Nelson Mandela was one of humanity's great leaders. He embodied the highest values of the United Nations.
Every day when you watched him lead from the front, from the back, from the side, was a masterclass.
Watch African Perspective on SABC News Channel 404 every Wednesday night at 9:30 p.m. Central African Time.
Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Now, this past week, Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng criticized the media for what he termed biased coverage. Now, speaking at the 67 Minutes Leadership Talk in Johannesburg on Wednesday, without naming any media organization or journalist, he said that certain media houses used select analysis on their programs to push certain agendas and narratives. He further called for the media to be more responsible in how they do their work and not be selective on the corruption that they choose to expose.
Our Constitution says our media houses exist to inform, not to misinform. the public. And there's a critical role that the media has to play to make sure that not some corruption, but all corruption is uprooted. The media has a critical role to play in ensuring not some unethical leaders are exposed, but all. No leader, the private sector, political system, in the judiciary and in the media, ought to be allowed to target innocent people and make them look bad for flimsy reasons. And we just sit back and say, it's none of our business.
All right, so that was the Chief Justice saying that we sometimes choose our battles. And let me start with you, Alex. Are we, as a media fraternity, biased? I don't think so, personally, but the perception might be there if we listen to what the Chief Justice's observations are.
You know, as a media as a whole, I'm going to have to agree with you. I don't think they're biased. In fact, I've never worked for a company where I've had a senior editor tell me how to structure a story, the narrative I must follow. I've never written an opinion piece where I've been told this is what you need to say, this is what this is the agenda you have to cover. So I sometimes wonder about these things. I don't always think it's a true reflection. Can there be some bias in certain stories? Yeah, sure. Perhaps that's unavoidable. But as a whole, I don't think so. I think the media as a whole, as a big space, does pretty well to cover things and to cover them from different angles.
Rulani, where do the perceptions of bias then come in? Because
of course they exist. I mean, Peter, remember in 2017 the Steinhoff story? Billions of rent was lost there, and we spoke about accounting irregularities in the media. But when it came to VBS, it was called large-scale looting and corruption. And why are we not using the same phrase? But you may find, I mean, the modus operandi could have been different. And Steinhoff, people lost a lot of money there, which is more, but we all just calling it accounting irregularities. Remember, as the media, we are the one who, to a certain extent, set the agenda. We decide whether this is just a cash in transit robbery or was just botched car hijacking. To a certain extent, we decide how the South African public could view a specific story. How big do we paint the corruption, or do we paint it mildly? Do we paint it hugely? I mean, VBS was a very big story. I mean, municipalities lost a lot of money there, but it got more coverage than Steinhoff.
So the language that we use, Alex, can really contribute to some of this. And I remember mulling over the Marikana story. Some called it a massacre, some called it shootings, killings, and the words you use perhaps frame us in a certain way, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Rulani. There were definitely, on the Steinhoff issue, there were definitely people that were just calling it irregularities, but there were also publications and journalists writing pieces calling it, mass-scale corruption, and I do think it, it did also receive attention. Yes, VBS received a lot more, and perhaps that's because there are politicians implicated in this. But I also think one needs to remember that, a journalist's job is to obviously report the news, to report the truth as they understand it. But at the end of the day, there needs to be money made from this. And I do think when things don't get a lot of attention, those things sometimes do get put on the back burner. When there isn't enough media attention around something, these type of stories fall off. And I'm not just talking about big stories, to small, to your small, little criminal robbery stories as well. We'll cover it once or twice, and then the attention dies away, and then that story just falls off. And I think that's also something to consider, especially with seeing as we're talking about, the media. One also needs to consider how small newsrooms have become across all publications. We don't have 10 investigative journalists anymore. Most publications have one or two. So that also makes a major difference on how much gets broken and how much gets covered on a daily basis.
You know, it reminds me of when we're busy being taught journalism. Orlando Pirates play Kaizer Chiefs. Orlando Pirates take a penalty, the goalkeeper saves. And the headline could be, Orlando Pirates miss a penalty or Kaizer Chiefs save a penalty. So again, it's a kind of angles, and it shifts and with the words we use. Well, the Chief Justice also said sometimes we show bias by the people that we choose to interview. Let's listen to this.
In some media platforms, when certain issues are to be discussed, there is a cohort of carefully selected analysts, and you can tell in advance when this one appears, there's a particular narrative that is going to be championed. That's not how to build a country. You need objectivity.
All right, so it does happen, and the same analysts, economists, you name it, are used over and over again. Are we contributing to this problem of the perception that we're biased by the people that we interview?
I think what maybe we could do is that talking on one specific issue, we could have two analysts who coming from different opinions, who are going to bring different opinions and bring them into studio and say, this is what I believe, and the other one put their side of the story. Because if we're feeding people one analysis and then we automatically saying to people, believe this is a better way of doing things, this is how things have to be done. And I really think that it's a challenge on all of us when we're busy preparing for our shows and our discussions to broaden our search for people who have different opinions. And we shouldn't silence those people who we don't agree with. You may find that actually the people that we don't agree with are the ones who are actually getting it right.
Yeah.
So we need to try and listen to everybody. You may find that that person who, I mean, how many people thought that Bafana Bafana would make it to the quarterfinals in AFCON?
Nobody.
There were only a few people.
Yeah.
I listened to different radio stations. One or two people on different stations said, you know what, anything could happen, give them a chance. But because nobody used those people as analysts, we used the sports analysts that we normally use, we missed that possibility. And when it happened, all of us were like, wow.
Yeah. So Alex, how is it? I mean, I think sometimes we're under pressure for time and we go to the names in our phone book that we know already and we don't start searching for other voices. So is that some of the challenges that we're facing?
I think on this I can perhaps agree with the Chief Justice. Yes, we are using, I don't know if we're cognitively using certain analysts to push a narrative. I don't know about that. But yeah, the media fraternity as a whole is using the same voices, and that's because these voices have obviously become well known and trusted voices. But I definitely think there is space to do a lot more searching, to look for new voices, to look for other ideas and other opinions, as opposed to recycling the same analysis over and over again.
All right, again, talking about language, and I'm going to go back to the Chief Justice because he's had a lot of gems this past week, and this talks about the story, the SARS rogue unit and that witness, and one of the Sunday newspapers described him as a I think the pot-smoking Rastafarian. And a lot of people got upset with that. This is what the Chief Justice had to say.
Reading the article, I, like a few people, one colleague in particular of mine that I discussed the story with, was left thinking, but what a crazy thing. How do you go and consult, in fact, lie that you've consulted a person who even looks like he's on a high all the time? I was a bit pricked by the fact that he's unemployed. It shouldn't be a factor. There are many South Africans who are unemployed. So it's not about any personality. It's about truth finding. When I heard that man and the kind of detail he gave, I was shocked. I almost fell from my chair.
All right, so, and it is this thing. I mean, if we go back to the apartheid era, it was deliberate. They'll say a Zulu-speaking man did X, Y, Z. Yes. And there was an agenda for that, wasn't there? In 2019, do we need to say he's Rastafarian when we're talking about the SARS rogue unit, Rulani?
It wasn't necessary. It was just not necessary, because next time you're going to say that witness with a big head. You're going to say that one who likes dressing up like this. So it's I think we should not glamorize facts. Naming the person wasn't enough. It wasn't necessary to put all those adjectives, because you see, sometimes putting a lot of adjectives when you're describing a person or a situation, controversial. Who decides what is controversial? Who decides on certain things? And describing him as a dope-smoking human being, what impact does it have on the story? Discussing a person as being short or tall or any other thing. Remember, as a country, we're still going through the process of dealing away with different forms of discrimination. And this was just one of those. And we as the media, we need to guard against being used or maybe allowing ourselves to put information which has nothing to do with anything at that point in time. Yes. And I think maybe people could have missed it before they went to print on this, and it's something that we should guard against. Those adjectives trying to glorify or unglorify a person, we should guard against them, because who decides who's controversial and who's not?
It's interesting, isn't it? Alex, your thought on this?
I agree with Rulani on this. I don't think that it was necessary for the story to point out that he's a dope smoker or a Rastafarian.
Because you are taught as journalists, though, aren't you, is your description, does it add to the story? Is it important to the story that it was a black man, that it was a Zimbabwean? Because is the story able to be told without those details?
Well, that's exactly it. I think, when you read that intro, I certainly got the sense that they put that in to try and discredit the guy even further, to try and make him seem like a non-authoritative voice on the matter. That's the feeling I got. I do see the journalist who wrote the story answered a couple questions with the Citizen, where he said the only reason he described him as a Rastafarian is because that's how he described himself. So I see that was his defense, and I see that he said that he didn't put the dope smoking into the article. That was done, obviously, through an editing process. But again, I have
that speaks to an agenda, then, if it was being added.
Precisely. But I have to agree, I don't think it was necessary to the story.
All right.
It doesn't give any more clout to the story.
Okay. All right. We'll leave that one and take another quick break. And when we come back, we'll start to explore what's been happening in our digital space and what's on the front pages of the paper. Stay with us. Right, welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. So we've been looking a lot at some of the thoughts that people out there beyond the media have about the media. And there's a suggestion that sometimes we're biased and sometimes we do score own goals. Well, this past week, the former president, Jacob Zuma, was at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, and one of the lines of questions was about the setting up of the newspaper, The New Age. And this is what the president had to say about why he was involved one way or another in this paper coming to the fore.
There had been a problem that worried us, all of us, that in this country, the media is very biased. At all material times, it's just critical. It criticizes the country, etc. There is no alternative voice. And if people could complain and say I abused them, that one I could plead guilty. Because I then one day, having known that we have been trying to have business who are progressive, to establish a media sort of alternative voice of what is happening. I think even people who are ANC members had tried even to partner with other people. It had never worked. At that time, I was the president of the ANC. I then said to them, men, and making a suggestion, can you try a business, a media business? Because we are comrades, we need an alternative voice. There are many attempts that have been made before by progressive people, but they've never worked. Is it possible that you could establish a newspaper? They'd never thought of the idea. And we discussed this. They finally said, I think it's a good idea because it is business.
All right, so that good idea was eventually a newspaper called The New Age and a television channel known as ANN7. All right, so alternative voice. Rolani, let me start with you. Alternative voice. But the question then, I guess, is, you know, the president of the country helps you set up a newspaper. Can you possibly be objective?
Well, it was an alternative voice. It was a very interesting, the TV channel, I watched it a lot of times. And yeah, they were real an alternative voice in that, in their broadcasts and in the stories they covered. Maybe they achieved what the ANC and the president wanted to do at the time. And I personally feel that, you know, presidents are people first. And, you know, how many other leaders are involved in media moguls or in their own countries? It's just that the way it happened, it was seen as like it was so boom and so different. And yeah, but they wanted an alternative voice. They didn't want a news organization which just follows the same headline as everybody else. So there we had it.
So fair play, it was an alternative voice. I mean, you know, if you go to the UK, you pick up the Times, you know it's pro-conservative. Pick up the Guardian, you know that it's pro-Labour. And so should media be objective or not biased towards, I mean, tell the truth, but private media surely can allow to pick a side if they want to.
A very interesting question, and I'm not sure I entirely have the answer. But yeah, sure, look, I think even if you look at the South African media landscape, you'll see the slants in the reportage. But it's still very important that the reporting is still true and still based on the facts provided, irrelevant of what the slant is. And I think, you know, unpopular opinion, but, you know, ANN7, The New Age, they had a lot of good journalists. And they did do a lot of good work. A lot of these journalists have gone on and, you know, they're incredible journalists. So I do feel that that was all a bit hard done by. Yes, there were different analysis, as we spoke about. The politics side was a bit different, but by and large, they were still very good, hard-working journalists. And I can tell you, I obviously know some of them personally, and I don't think many of those journalists were would have ever changed, you know, their story or their narrative.
So a lot of good stories and a lot of good work that the ANN7 and New Age did. Some of those stories were phenomenal, and perhaps in the end became undone because of who owned it rather than the quality of the journalism, Roland.
I think so, because and you know, sometimes they would cover a story and it would take about 3-4 months for the other media houses to say, we just follow up on this story. And they really did a lot of good work. I agree with Alex. So it just so happened that the way it was formed, I mean, remember at the State Capture Commission, there was a gentleman from the National Treasury, Jan Gilliland, who gave evidence about monies which were channeled from GCIS into different Oak Bay, Gupta-related accounts, TNA, media, TNA, whatever. There were different variations, and all sorts of things happened at the beginning. At the beginning of the establishment of especially the television channel. Yeah. I think it was all about how did they get the money, how did everything start, and everything, more than the content which they provided. Because if we go back to the evidence that's already at the State Capture Commission, you find that there was a lot of money which maybe was ended up in the media group, which should not have been there.
All right, okay. Unfortunately, as often happens with live programs such as this, we're going to have to cut this one early today because the President is about to make a speech at a funeral. So to both of you, I want to say thank you very much indeed for joining us on Media Monitor, and I hope to have you on the program again in the near future. Thanks so much for coming through. All right, and that's where we're going to leave Media Monitor for today, as we now go live to where the President is addressing some morning.